Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Now, I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories late at night. Some of you even fall asleep to them. But tonight's tales may make you think twice about closing your eyes. Imagine waking aboard the International Space Station, only to realize you carry decades of memories. Memories of living entire lives on alien worlds with families, homes, and even neighbors who feel more real than dreams. This is what astronauts have reported in what NASA quietly calls the sleep experiment. And tonight, we'll be diving into 12 of their most chilling testimonies. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far this community stretches around the world. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these stories. It really helps the channel grow. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. It began with a man known to the world as a hero, a Russian cosmonaut who had already spent more than a year aboard the International Space Station. His name doesn't appear in official transcripts anymore. In fact, the records you can find now list him as unavailable for comment. But those who were there, they remember what happened. The first time it occurred, his fellow crew members awoke to the sound of him sobbing. Not quietly, not the muted grief of someone trying to hide their pain, but loud, raw weeping that echoed through the ISS like a wound cut into the silence of space itself. When they finally reached his cabin, they found him sitting up in his bunk, hands shaking, tears running down his face. And in a trembling voice, he began to explain. He hadn't been asleep for a few hours. He hadn't dreamed a single night. He said he had lived an entire lifetime, 37 years, on a world he could not name, under a sky lit by two suns. He described it as though he had walked there only yesterday. Rolling hills of crimson grass that hummed when the wind touched them, long shadows that stretched in impossible directions beneath the twin lights of dawn. He told them he had built a house there with his own hands, a modest farmhouse made of a pale stone that glowed faintly at night, as though it remembered the heat of the suns. And he spoke of a woman, a wife, someone he could not have invented, not with the detail he recalled. He remembered the exact pattern of freckles across her cheek, the lilt of her laughter when she called him in for supper, the way her hands smelled faintly of the alien herbs she grew outside their door. Together, he said, they had children. 3 of them. He remembered their names, their voices, even the sound of their small feet running through the halls of their home. When his fellow astronauts tried to comfort him, he shook his head riotously. No dream, he insisted. Not dream. I remember everything. He described birthdays celebrated beneath 2 suns that never truly set, arguments and reconciliations, long nights spent telling his children stories before they slept. He remembered the feel of the soil beneath his fingernails, the taste of the food they grew, the ache in his back from decades of labor. 37 years, and then he woke. Back aboard the ISS. Exactly where he had fallen asleep only 7 hours earlier. He began to panic. He searched the cabin for the clothes he swore he had worn the day before, a worn shirt his wife had mended at least a dozen times. He searched for a locket his daughter had given him. None of it was there. His crewmates tried to calm him. They told him he had been dreaming, but he refused to believe it. He said he could still smell the air of that world, a strange metallic sweetness that lingered in his nostrils. And worse still, he could hear something none of the others did. Faint static in the corners of the station, and beneath it, the laughter of children. He begged them to tell him they could hear it too, but they could not. From that day forward, he was never the same. He performed his duties, but his eyes were always elsewhere. And at night, when he finally drifted off to sleep, he would clutch at his chest and cry silently. because for him, the mornings weren't mornings at all. They were endings. Endings to a life he had loved, a family he had cherished, and a world that existed only when he closed his eyes. To this day, those who worked with him swear that sometimes, even years later, when the recording equipment in orbit captured moments of silence, faintly, in the background, you could hear the static, and beneath it, the unmistakable laughter of children. The second testimony came from an American astronaut, one known for his sharp wit, his easy smile, and the steady hands that had guided shuttles through some of the most dangerous missions in recent memory. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man NASA wanted to put in orbit. Calm under pressure, a master of procedure, someone who didn't scare easily. But on his return from the ISS, colleagues described him as changed, quiet, distracted. He would sit for hours in silence, staring out of windows as though expecting to see something other than Earth on the other side. And eventually, when pressed, he confessed why. He swore that he had lived for decades in a farmhouse on rolling alien plains. Plains he described in unnerving, specific detail. The land stretched wide and endless, covered not in grass, but in something like glass reeds that shifted and chimed in the wind. At sunset, those reeds turned blood red, painting the horizon with fire, and in the middle of it all stood his house, a wooden farmhouse with peeling paint, shutters that rattled in the night, and floorboards that always creaked under his feet. It was familiar, too familiar, because it was haunted. He said he never questioned how he'd come to live there. In the dream life, it was simply his. He knew which cupboard door stuck when you tried to close it, which window banged in the night when storms rolled across the plains. He knew where the kettle whistled too sharply, and where the stairs dipped in the middle, forcing him to catch himself every time. And yet, every night, the house changed. Doors that he swore he had locked creaked open on their own. Hallways seemed longer. The attic stairs appeared where he was certain no stairs had been the night before. And the whispers, always the whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind sliding through cracks in the walls. But as the years passed, years that felt as real as any he'd lived on Earth, he began to recognize words, his name, his secrets, snatches of conversations he'd had as a child, sentences spoken long ago by voices he couldn't possibly remember. He told NASA doctors he could still hear those whispers when the ISS went silent, not with his ears, but somewhere behind them, as if the farmhouse had lodged itself in his skull and refused to let go. One detail chilled his interrogators most of all. He described walking through the farmhouse late one night, following the whispers, and finding every door open, every cupboard, every closet, every window, swinging slowly as though inviting him in. And at the end of the hall, his own bedroom door stood ajar. Inside, he said, was not the bed he'd left behind, not the quilt, not the lamp, not the room he had come to know, but a bunk, a metal bunk, and the curved walls of the International Space Station. And on that bunk was him, sleeping. He woke screaming, thrashing in zero gravity, his crewmates shaken awake by his panic. And though they tried to calm him, he would not, could not, return to sleep without terror. To this day, when he gives interviews, his answers drift. He admits he still hears the farmhouse at night, the creak of the boards, the soft, insistent whispering that tells him the house is waiting. And worst of all, it sounds patient. The third account in what NASA later called the sleep experiment came from a woman who had spent most of her career breaking barriers. She was one of the first to complete back-to-back 6-month missions aboard the ISS, and her reputation was that of someone unshakable, steady, disciplined, almost unnervingly calm. But her testimony was anything but calm. She claimed she had not just dreamed, but lived in a sprawling alien mansion. It was unlike any building she had ever seen on Earth. Impossibly tall archways, staircases that bent in curves too sharp for the human eye, and ceilings painted with constellations she had never recognized. She remembered the place as though she had walked its halls for decades. Corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, chandeliers that glowed without flame or filament, and rooms filled with strange instruments that hummed softly when she touched them. But always, there was one door that never opened. She described it in vivid detail. A tall oak door, darker than any other in the house, with a handle that glinted faintly like polished silver. Every day she passed it. Every night, she heard faint sounds from behind it, scratching, shuffling, sometimes even the muffled echo of her own voice. And though she lived years in that place, decades in her memory, she never dared to turn the handle. Not until the final night. She recalled that evening with an almost painful clarity. The mansion was silent. Too silent. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her more intently than usual. The chandeliers above flickered like they were about to go out, and she felt in her bones that the house itself was urging her toward that door. Her hand shook as she reached for the handle. Her breath came shallow and fast. And then, for the first time in all those years, the door opened. What she saw on the other side wasn't a room. It wasn't a library or a hall or a staircase leading deeper into the mansion. It was the International Space Station, her own cabin. And on the bunk, curled in sleep, was herself. She described standing frozen, unable to move, as if she were both intruder and ghost. The version of herself lying on the bunk shifted, turned slightly, and in that half-lit glow of the ISS she realized with horror the sleeper's eyes were open, watching her. The two of them stared at each other, the one on the bed with pupils black as void, the one in the doorway trembling in terror. And then, without sound, the version on the bunk whispered something she could not hear. She woke screaming, thrashing against the harness of her ISS sleeping pod, her crewmates rushing to restrain her. But no amount of reassurance could shake what she had seen. She swore it was no dream. She swore she had opened that door, and what lay beyond was not just her imagination, but another truth. Another reality bleeding into this one. Even after she returned to Earth, she said she couldn't pass a closed door without shuddering. For in her mind, every door might be that one. And every time she touched a handle, she feared what she might see waiting on the other side. The fourth testimony came from a man who had spent his career insisting he wasn't afraid of anything. He was a test pilot first, an astronaut second, and in his words, fear was a luxury for people who could afford to crash. He had seen engines fail, felt aircraft rattle apart mid-air, and walked away smiling. But what he described after the sleep experiment wiped that smile away for good. He said he had lived in a structure that felt part house, part machine, an alien dwelling where walls were too smooth, corners too sharp, and vents hummed like a living lung. At first, he thought the place was empty, silent, safe. But then, on the second night, he heard it. Laughter. Not the laughter of adults, not mocking, not cruel, but the laughter of children, soft, fleeting, like a game being played just out of sight. He froze, straining to listen. The sound came from behind the walls, rising and falling as though dozens of tiny feet were running in the vents above him. He told himself it was imagination, an echo, perhaps even his own memories bleeding into this strange dream. But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to years in that alien house, the laughter never stopped. At night, when the lights dimmed, he would hear the patter of feet racing just over his head. Sometimes they would pause, right above his room, as though the unseen children were crouching together, whispering about him. One evening, he gathered his courage and climbed up into the vents. He crawled on his stomach through the narrow shafts, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting across smooth metallic surfaces that seemed to stretch forever. But no matter how far he crawled, the laughter always stayed just ahead of him. Never closer, never farther, always leading him deeper. He turned corners. He crawled for hours. The air grew colder, thinner. His flashlight began to flicker, and then, just when he thought he had reached the end, he found a small handprint smeared against the wall. Not human, smaller, too many fingers. When he blinked, it was gone. He returned to his bed, shaken, and vowed never to crawl the vents again. But the children, if that's what they were, never left him. They began whispering his name. He swore that every time he closed his eyes he heard it, a sing-song chant of his name, spoken in voices that didn't belong to Earth. He never saw their faces. He never knew what they wanted. But their laughter filled every moment of his long dream life until the day he woke. And when he woke, he wasn't free of them. Back aboard the ISS, lying in the familiar hum of the station, he told his crewmates that he heard it again. The faint tap of feet in the ductwork above, the giggle of unseen children in the walls. They thought he was joking. Until one night, during lights out, a recording device left running in the cabin picked up something. Not the hiss of air, not the buzz of machinery, but faint giggling, metallic echoes. The laughter of children where no children had ever been. He has never slept peacefully again. The fifth testimony came from a man who, until then, had never spoken publicly about fear. A combat veteran turned astronaut, he had built his career on control. Control of his body, his mind, and the environments around him. His crewmates described him as unflappable, the kind of man who would calmly sip coffee while alarms blared around him. But when the sleep experiment took hold, even he could not keep that calm. He said that in his dream life, he lived in a house not unlike the ones back home on Earth. 4 walls, a roof, a bed by the window. It should have been a place of comfort. But the first night he closed his eyes there, he realized he was not alone. At the foot of his bed stood a figure. He described it in fragments. Tall, thin, unmoving. Its edges seemed blurred, as though it were made of shadow rather than flesh. He could not see its face. Sometimes it seemed to tilt its head. Other times its arms twitched in a slow, almost curious motion. But always, it stood at the foot of his bed, watching. The first time he saw it, he told himself it was nothing more than imagination, a nightmare brought on by stress. But when he lay down the next night, it was there again. And the night after that. And the night after that. For decades in his mind, he lived with this figure. He never heard it speak. He never saw it move closer. But its silence was worse than any threat. It stood there, night after night, its presence pressing into him, until he began to dread the moment the suns of that alien world would sink below the horizon. He tried everything. Sleeping in another room, boarding up the windows, locking the doors. But no matter where he lay his head, the figure always found him, standing, waiting, watching. He said he began to lose track of whether he was asleep or awake. Sometimes he would wander through the house, desperate for rest, only to turn a corner and see the figure already there, as if it had been waiting. And then, one night, something changed. The figure lifted its hand, slowly, deliberately, and it pointed to the ceiling. He followed the gesture and saw light fixtures flickering above him. Fixtures that did not belong to that alien house at all. Fixtures he recognized instantly. The lights of the ISS. He woke, gasping, his body tangled in the restraints of his real bunk. And as he struggled to slow his heartbeat, he saw it, the light above him flickering violently, buzzing as though something unseen pressed against the circuits. His crewmates slept on, unaware. But he knew. Something had followed him back. From that night forward, every time the ISS lights dimmed for sleep, he claimed he saw movement. A shadow flickering at the edge of his vision. The faint outline of something waiting at the foot of his bed. And though no one else on board admitted to seeing it, some of them confessed later that the lights in their cabins had begun to flicker too. The sixth account from the sleep experiment is perhaps the most unsettling, because it was not simply described as a dream. The astronaut who lived it refused to call it that at all. He insisted it was a memory, not of exploration or discovery, but of imprisonment. He claimed that when he closed his eyes aboard the ISS, he found himself standing in a corridor. At first, it looked ordinary enough. A long hallway lined with doors, each one identical, each one closed. The floor was stone. The walls were a strange pale grey that seemed to absorb the light. But when he opened the first door, expecting to step into a room, he found another corridor. The same walls, the same floor, the same endless row of doors stretching into shadow. He tried again. Another door. Another corridor. On and on it went, door after door, each one leading him deeper into what felt like an infinite labyrinth. There were no windows, no stairs, no turns. Only endless straight lines, lined with doors that offered no escape. He said the worst part wasn't the sameness. It was the sound. Every time he opened a door, the corridor behind him would close in silence, sealing off the path back. And faintly, just faintly, he began to hear breathing, not his own. Something else moving through the halls with him. The years passed there. Years he swore were as vivid as any on earth. He lost track of how many doors he had opened. Hundreds? Thousands? Perhaps more. He scratched marks into the walls to keep count. But when he looked back, the marks were gone. The corridors seemed to erase any trace of his existence, swallowing his efforts into nothingness. He tried running, sprinting from door to door, desperate for an exit. But no matter how far he went, he always found himself at the same place. The same hall, the same doors, the same echo of footsteps that didn't belong to him. And then, one day, if days even existed there, he opened a door and found something new. A mirror. It was cracked, its surface dark, but when he stared into it, he didn't see himself as he was. He saw himself aged, decades older, his hair grey, his eyes hollow, his face worn by despair, and standing just behind his reflection was a shadow. A figure he could not describe, except that it leaned close to the glass, watching him with a hunger that froze him where he stood. He slammed the door shut, but when he turned, the corridor behind him was gone. He was trapped. He claimed he spent the rest of his years in that place, opening doors that led only to more doors. A maze without exit. A prison designed not to punish his body, but to break his mind. And then, suddenly, he woke. Back on the ISS. His crewmates said he was drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, his fingernails torn as if he'd been clawing at something. When asked about it later, he shook his head. Not dream, he said. Memory. I was there. I am still there. And one day, when I close my eyes again, I'll go back. The seventh account from the sleep experiment is one of the most human, and perhaps the most cruel. This astronaut, a quiet and soft-spoken man, said that when he closed his eyes aboard the ISS, he awoke not in a house or a corridor, but in a neighborhood, a place eerily similar to the suburbs of Earth, though stretched across alien plains beneath a sky painted in shifting colors. There were streets, houses, yards filled with strange blossoms that opened only at night, and neighbors, dozens of them, who waved when he passed, who smiled as he walked by. At first it felt almost comforting. He said they invited him to dinner, shared food that shimmered faintly on the plate, glowing with heat long after it was served. They laughed, though the sound was slightly off, too sharp, too drawn out, echoing strangely in his ears. Still, he convinced himself it was kindness. For weeks, or years, depending on how time moved in that place, he lived among them. They asked about his family. They asked about his home. They seemed fascinated by Earth, though they spoke of it as though it were a place they had only read about, not somewhere they had ever seen. But then, something changed. One evening, when he waved to a neighbor across the street, the smile did not come. Instead, the figure simply stared. Its eyes were darker, its face expressionless. The next day, another neighbor did the same, then another. Soon, the entire neighborhood stopped smiling. The laughter that had once spilled out of windows turned to whispers. The warmth that had welcomed him shifted into a cold, watchful silence. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was nothing. But each night, the whispers grew louder. He could hear them when he lay down in his alien bed, voices moving just outside his window, circling the house. And then, on the final night, the whispers joined together. Dozens of voices, hundreds perhaps, rising in eerie unison. "You don't belong here." He rushed to the window and saw them, every neighbor standing in the street, their faces pale under the alien sky, their mouths moving together in perfect rhythm. He tried to shout back, to demand what they meant, but his voice caught in his throat. The crowd grew louder, chanting the words again and again until the sound pressed into his skull like a physical weight. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." He staggered back from the window, clutched his ears, but the sound was inside him now. It filled the house, filled every corner, shook the walls. The air seemed to vibrate with it. And then silence. When he opened his eyes again, he was back on the ISS. His crewmates said he woke screaming, clawing at his harness, whispering the phrase over and over as though repeating a lesson drilled into him. Even on Earth, he admitted he still hears it. In the hum of air conditioners, in the distant chatter of crowds, sometimes in the static of a dead radio channel. The same words, always in unison. "You don't belong here." The eighth account from the sleep experiment comes from an astronaut whose voice reportedly shook as he gave it. He wasn't a man prone to dramatics. His colleagues described him as logical, technical, an engineer who solved problems with numbers, not feelings. But numbers couldn't explain what he saw in that place. He said that in his dream life, the alien home assigned to him was sparse, almost sterile. The walls were pale and cold, the furniture bare, the air too still. Yet in the center of it all, in a hallway he swore he never remembered building or entering, stood a mirror. At first he avoided it. Something about the way it stood bothered him. It didn't hang from a wall or rest against the floor. It seemed to float, anchored in place by nothing. And when he passed it the first time, he froze, because his reflection wasn't quite right. He described the face staring back at him as older, decades older, wrinkles carved deep into his skin, hair thinned and graying, eyes sunken with years of exhaustion. He reached up to touch his face and found his skin still smooth, his features unchanged. But the reflection did not follow. It smiled faintly, a smile that did not belong to him. The next time he walked by, the reflection was older still. his back hunched, his hands trembling, his frame frail. He spent what felt like years in that alien home, and each day the mirror showed a new stage of decay, as though his entire life were being stolen in fragments. He told himself it was just a dream, a hallucination. But when he touched the mirror, the glass was warm, like skin, and the reflection pressed back against his hand as though alive. And then, one night, the reflection wasn't him at all. He described waking from a restless sleep in that alien house, drawn to the hallway where the mirror stood. And when he looked, he saw a face staring back. Not his, not older, not you, Unger, but someone else entirely. The eyes were pitch black, bottomless. The mouth curled into a wide grin, and when it opened, no words came out, only a deep, resonant sound, like 1,000 whispers layered together, speaking in languages he couldn't understand. He tried to look away, but the mirror held him, his limbs locked, his breathing shallow. He said it felt as though the reflection were pulling him in, stripping away everything that tethered him to himself. And then he woke. Back on the ISS, strapped into his bunk. But when he glanced at the reflective surface of a nearby panel, he swore he saw it again. The same black eyes, the same grin. From that moment, he avoided mirrors. He covered reflective surfaces. He refused to shave in front of a glass. Even the shimmer of water unsettled him, for fear that the wrong face might look back. When asked later whether he believed it was just a dream, he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "That wasn't a dream. That was a warning." The 9th account from the sleep experiment was one that left even seasoned doctors uneasy. The astronaut who gave it had no history of nightmares, no trace of superstition in his life. He was a man of logic, grounded in science and engineering, the kind who laughed at ghost stories. But what he experienced left him shaken in ways he could never explain. He claimed his dream life had taken him to an alien home, built of unfamiliar stone and timber that seemed alive, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of a heart. For years, he said, he lived within those walls, adjusting to their strange hum, to the faint glow that seeped through cracks when the twin moons rose. But one night, it changed. He woke to the smell of smoke. At first, he thought it was only a dream within a dream. But then he heard it. The groan of timbers overhead, the hiss of fire spreading through the upper floors. He staggered from his bed, the air already thick, choking. The sound of screams echoed through the halls. Voices he swore belonged to people he had never seen, yet somehow knew were part of the house. Their cries blended with the roar of the fire, as though the structure itself were in agony. He rushed through corridors, searching for the source, and then he realized where it was coming from. The attic. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, each step shaking beneath his feet as flames licked the walls. Smoke poured downward, filling his lungs, searing his throat. He said the smell was unforgettable, acrid, metallic, almost sweet, as though the fire were burning not just wood, but something alive. When he reached the attic door, it was already glowing red with heat. He hesitated, knowing what waited beyond, yet unable to stop himself. He pushed it open. Inside, the fire was everywhere. The beams overhead collapsed in showers of sparks. The walls writhed like they were alive, faces pressing through. At the surface, screaming silently as the flames consumed them, and through the smoke, he saw shapes, shadows running, flailing, burning. He tried to scream for help, but the smoke stole his voice. His vision blurred. His chest tightened. He fell to his knees, gasping, clawing at the floor for air. And then, with a violent jerk, he woke. Back on the ISS, strapped into his bunk, but coughing, violently, uncontrollably. His crewmates rushed to him, panicked, thinking some failure in the oxygen system had poisoned him. But when they checked, everything was normal. Still, he couldn't stop choking. His eyes watered, his throat burned, and worst of all, when he spat into a tissue, they found black flecks of ash. Phantom ash, from a fire that had never existed. Even weeks later, after he had returned to Earth, he complained of a faint smoke that lingered in his lungs. He could be walking under clear skies, breathing fresh air, and suddenly he'd feel it again. A heat in his chest, the sting of invisible cinders. He avoided houses after that. He said he couldn't bring himself to climb stairs, not when every creak of wood sounded like the groan of beams ready to collapse in flame. And in quiet moments, when he closed his eyes, he swore he could still hear the attic burning forever and ever in some place he had left behind.
The 10th account from the sleep experiment is perhaps the cruelest of them all. It wasn't about monsters in the dark, or endless corridors, or houses that burned. This one was about love and loss. The astronaut who gave it swore that in his dream life he lived 50 years with a family, a wife and 3 children. He remembered their names, their laughter, their faces as clearly as if they had walked beside him on Earth. He remembered small details, the way his wife's hair caught the alien sunlight, the way his youngest child held onto his finger when they walked together, the way the older ones argued over chores in voices that made him smile. For decades, he said, this was his life. A quiet farmhouse beneath 2 moons, meals around the table, nights by the fire, telling stories until the children fell asleep. He grew old there. He loved there. But then, the vanishings began. It started small. One morning he woke and his eldest son's chair at the table was empty. The bed was made. The belongings gone. His wife and other children carried on as though nothing had changed. When he demanded to know where his son had gone, they only blinked at him, confused. "What son?" they asked. He thought he was losing his mind. But the next morning his second child was gone. The toys disappeared. The laughter silenced. Again, the others acted as though that child had never existed. Night after night, it continued. Each morning, someone else was missing. He begged his wife to explain, but she only smiled at him sadly, as though she knew something he didn't. And then one morning, she too was gone. Her side of the bed was cold. Her clothes, her books, every trace of her vanished. He staggered through the empty house, calling her name, calling all of their names, but the silence swallowed every word. By the end, he was alone. For weeks, or what felt like weeks, he wandered through that house, every room echoing with absence. He searched the fields outside, shouting until his voice broke, but the plains remained empty. The house that had once been full of love now rang hollow, and every night the silence grew heavier, pressing into him like a weight he could not bear. And then, one morning, he woke again, not in that farmhouse, but back on the ISS. His bunk was cold, the air sterile, his crewmates asleep around him. But he carried the grief with him, heavy and unshakable. He insisted it was no dream. He insisted he had lived 50 years in that house, had held his children, had kissed his wife, had watched them disappear one by one. And now, he said, the silence followed him. Even in orbit, he claimed he sometimes awoke to find the bunk beside him cold, as though someone had just slipped away. When pressed to explain what it meant, he only shook his head. They weren't dreams, he whispered. They were real. They were mine. And they're gone. The 11th account from the sleep experiment carried an unusual weight. This astronaut didn't speak about his experience easily. When he finally did, he confessed that even years later, he could not enter a basement on Earth without trembling. He said that in his dream life, his alien home had always carried one constant, a basement. From the very first day, he felt its presence. The narrow door tucked behind the kitchen stairs, the cold draft that drifted up from beneath it, the iron handle that seemed to hum faintly beneath his touch, as if something alive waited on the other side. But he never opened it. For decades in that place, he avoided the basement. He built a life around it, meals, chores, routines. But every night as he lay in bed, he could feel it below, like a heartbeat buried deep underground. He said that sometimes, when the house grew quiet, he heard noises seeping up through the floorboards. A low groan, a scrape. Once, the distinct sound of something shifting against stone. He told himself it was his imagination, that if he ignored it, it would leave him alone. But the basement did not want to be ignored. On his final night in that alien home, he woke with the overwhelming certainty that it was time, that the house itself was waiting for him to descend those stairs. He rose from bed, his body heavy as though weighed down by unseen hands, and walked to the door. The air that spilled out was colder than anything he had ever felt. Damp, heavy. It carried with it a faint metallic tang, like rust and old blood. He hesitated at the top of the steps, staring down into the black. But then he heard it. A single, steady sound. Thud, thud, thud. The heartbeat, louder now, pulsing through the darkness, vibrating through his bones. Step by step, he descended, the wood groaning beneath him. The walls closed in, the air thickened, and at the bottom, in the center of that lightless room, he saw it. A stone, black as void, perfectly smooth yet somehow alive, pulsing with a dull light that throbbed in rhythm with the heartbeat. He said the moment his eyes locked onto it, his mind flooded with memories that weren't his. Centuries of voices, whispers of civilizations that had touched the stone and been destroyed by it. He felt it probing him, searching, pulling. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body would not obey. He was rooted in place, staring, trembling, as the stone's pulse grew stronger, filling the room with lightless pressure. And then, just as he thought it would consume him, he woke. Back on the ISS. He was drenched in sweat, gasping for air, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails had drawn blood from his palms, but he swore he could still feel it. The pulse, the weight, the presence of the stone. And in his debrief, he whispered something that chilled even the most skeptical listener. "It wasn't a dream," he said. "It's waiting. And one day, it will find a way back." The 12th and final testimony from the sleep experiment is the one NASA tried hardest to bury, because this time it wasn't just one astronaut who claimed to dream a different life. It was all of them. On the same night. They said it began as any other cycle aboard the ISS. Lights dimmed, checklists completed. Crews strapped themselves into their bunks, letting the hum of machinery lull them into uneasy rest. But within minutes, every single astronaut was there, not in orbit, but standing together in the same alien place. A house. Not the farmhouse, not the mansion, not the corridors or basements described before. This was something different. A single structure built from stone that seemed to drink the starlight around it. Its roof pitched high against a sky the color of ash. The soil under their feet was dry, lifeless, and yet the house pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. Each astronaut later swore they recognized the house immediately. It was the place they had all described separately in their earlier accounts. The same locked doors, the same vents with laughter, the same mirrors and corridors. As though all their nightmares had been pieces of one whole. Inside, the air was heavy. The walls stretched into halls they knew but could not name. Every step they took seemed to echo in more than one direction at once, as if unseen feet walked alongside them. And then the voices began. Not whispers this time, but layered confessions. Their own voices, retelling the stories they had lived in the weeks before. One voice spoke of the children in the walls. Another described the figure at the foot of the bed. Another wept about a wife and children who had vanished. All at once, their testimonies echoed through the halls, their lives retold in a chorus of terror. They tried to escape, but every door led them deeper inside. And at the center of the house, in a chamber with outlight, they saw it. The black stone, pulsing, waiting. One astronaut swore it was the same stone described in the black basement. Another insisted it was larger, alive, breathing in rhythm with their hearts. And as they watched, the stone split open. Not with sound, but with silence. A silence so deep it crushed every thought. From inside, something moved. None of them could describe it clearly. A shape. A shadow. A presence that filled the chamber, stretching through them, pulling at their memories. They said it knew them. Every fear, every regret, every hidden thought. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with certainty. You are mine. In an instant, they all woke, screaming. Each astronaut thrashed in their bunks, their heart monitors spiking. Alarms blared across the ISS. Ground control scrambled, convinced some chemical leak or system failure had poisoned the entire crew. But the air was clean. The systems were fine. What no one could explain was that when the crew calmed enough to speak, they all described the same house, the same rooms, the same stone. Not a dream, a shared place. To this day, not one of those astronauts has been willing to sleep without fear. Some claim they still wake at night hearing each other's voices, retelling the stories. Others say they feel the pull of the house, waiting for them to return. And one, in an unguarded moment, admitted something worse. "We never left," he whispered. "We only woke up here. But part of us is still there." And that brings us to the end of tonight's testimonies from the sleep experiment. Which of these 12 stories unsettled you the most? Was it the vanishing family, the locked room, or the basement with the black stone? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I always love reading them. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying stories every week. Until next time, my friends, sleep well, if you can.